In 2006, 4 college friends vanished without a trace during a road trip through Nevada, leaving families shattered and a desert full of unanswered questions. 10 years later, a buried Jeep emerges from the sand, unlocking a trail of desperate journal entries, scattered remains, and the haunting truth of how the desert claimed them. The spring of 2006 was supposed to be a season of freedom for 4 college friends from California. They had just finished midterms and decided to celebrate with a week-long road trip through Nevada, chasing open highways, desert sunsets, and the kind of memories that only come with youth and unbroken trust in the world. Their names would soon become etched in news reports and missing person flyers, but at the time they were simply kids in their early 20s, piled into a dusty green Jeep Cherokee, windows down, music loud, laughter spilling out into the night air. They left behind worried parents with promises of daily check-ins and assurances that nothing bad could possibly happen on such a short trip. Friends on campus waved them off, already anticipating stories about roadside diners and nights under desert stars. Photos taken at the start of the trip showed bright smiles and easy camaraderie, 4 young faces full of life and expectation. It was the kind of journey that should have ended with tired but happy reunions at home. Instead, it dissolved into silence. The first warning signs appeared when calls went unanswered. Parents dialed repeatedly, only to reach voicemails that grew more alarming with each day. Messages stacked up with no reply. By the 3rd day of silence, panic began to spread among the families. The Nevada desert was vast, unforgiving, and filled with places where a single wrong turn could spell disaster. When they failed to return on schedule, the friends were officially reported missing. Law enforcement agencies from Nevada and California coordinated initial searches, focusing on the highways and towns that dotted the likely route. Patrol cars cruised dusty stretches of road, helicopters scanned from above, and investigators contacted motels and gas stations along the way. Nothing, not a trace of the Jeep, no evidence that the group had ever made it past the last town where they were seen. For the parents, the days that followed blurred into a waking nightmare. The kitchen phones never left their hands. They pored over maps, retraced possible routes, and begged authorities to expand the search. Their children had vanished into the emptiness of the Nevada desert, swallowed whole by a landscape that offered no clues and no comfort. It was the beginning of a mystery that would stretch on for a decade, a mystery that refused to yield its answers until the desert itself chose to give them up. The morning after the families reported the friends missing, search efforts moved quickly into motion. Sheriff's deputies from several Nevada counties coordinated with state patrols, establishing checkpoints along highways and secondary roads. Flyers with the faces of the 4 students were rushed to print and distributed to gas stations, diners, and motels in every town within a 100-mile radius. Volunteers from local communities joined law enforcement in combing the edges of the desert, their cars kicking up plumes of dust as they drove grid patterns across the barren expanse. Helicopters lifted off from regional airports, their searchlights sweeping the cracked earth below for the telltale glint of metal. At first, there was confidence. A Jeep was large enough to spot from the air, and the group's last confirmed sighting at a small-town service station gave investigators a starting point. Yet hour after hour passed without result. Pilots reported only the endless stretch of pale sand and scrub, roads that disappeared into nothing, and the occasional coyote darting across the landscape. On the ground, deputies stopped drivers along the highways, holding up the missing flyers and asking if anyone had seen 4 college kids in a green Jeep. Most shook their heads. Some mentioned seeing a similar vehicle days earlier, but none could recall anything certain. The families drove out themselves, unable to bear waiting at home. They followed the search convoys into the desert, eyes scanning the roadside for tire marks, abandoned belongings, any sign that their children had been there. At night they gathered in motel rooms, clinging to the belief that the Jeep had simply broken down somewhere remote, that their kids were alive and waiting for help to arrive. But as the second day bled into the third, worry hardened into dread. The desert had a way of erasing things, swallowing evidence beneath wind-blown sand. Search dogs brought in from neighboring states picked up faint scents near rest areas but lost the trail quickly in the shifting dust. Officials extended the search perimeter, calling in specialized units equipped with thermal cameras and all-terrain vehicles. Still, the landscape yielded nothing. The realization began to set in that 4 young lives had vanished as if into thin air. For investigators, it was a troubling puzzle. For the parents, it was an abyss opening beneath them, one that would not close until they had answers. In the first days after the disappearance, disbelief clung to the families like a fog. Parents, who had once been reassured by the laughter in their children's voices, now sat sleepless in their living rooms, staring at silent phones and waiting for calls that never came. The missing posters, printed in haste, showed smiling faces frozen in time, each photograph chosen with trembling hands and a desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize them. Neighbors dropped off food that went untouched, casseroles left cooling on kitchen counters, while mothers sat at tables with red-rimmed eyes, and fathers drove endless loops along highways, convinced they might spot the Jeep abandoned just out of sight. Siblings struggled to comprehend the sudden absence. Younger brothers and sisters scrolled through photo albums and old text messages, replaying every memory for signs they had missed. At school and on campus, the news spread quickly, and vigils were held beneath candlelight where classmates prayed aloud, their voices breaking as they tried to reconcile friendship with loss. Hope flickered with every rumor of a sighting, every unconfirmed report of the Jeep spotted at a truck stop or along a lonely stretch of road. Yet as days turned into weeks, the silence deepened. Search teams reported back with nothing but exhaustion. Helicopters had scanned the desert until fuel ran low. Volunteers had blistered their feet, marching across sand and stone, but no trace had surfaced. The families wrestled with impossible questions. Had their children simply broken down and wandered too far in search of help? Had someone stopped to offer assistance and, instead, led them into danger? The uncertainty was a wound that refused to close, leaving parents stuck between the fragile hope that the friends were still alive and the growing dread that they had been lost forever. At night, the desert grew impossibly still, and the families who camped near search zones spoke of the quiet pressing in around them. They knew their children had vanished into that silence, swallowed by an expanse that gave nothing back. Grief began to take root alongside hope, and in that uneasy balance, the families clung to each other, promising they would not let the world forget the 4 bright young lives that had gone missing on what was meant to be nothing more than a carefree road trip. News of the disappearance spread quickly, carried first by local radio stations and then picked up by regional and national outlets eager for a gripping story. 4 college students lost in the Nevada desert was the kind of mystery that captured the public imagination, and soon the friends' faces appeared on television screens across the country. Anchors spoke solemnly of the missing road trip, while commentators speculated endlessly about what might have happened. Some suggested the Jeep had broken down in the heat and the group had wandered off, victims of the unforgiving desert. Others whispered darker theories of foul play, abduction, or even the possibility that the friends had staged their disappearance to start new lives elsewhere. The families, already overwhelmed by fear, were forced to watch as strangers dissected their children's choices, scrutinizing their photos, social media posts, and personal histories for hidden meaning. The coverage drew reporters to Nevada, who stood against barren backdrops, describing the vast emptiness where the search was unfolding. Cameras followed investigators through scrubland and dry washes, but the images revealed little more than endless dust and rock. Rumors began to circulate online, fueled by the rise of early social media forums and true crime message boards. Anonymous users claimed to have seen the Jeep in remote towns or insisted the group had been spotted hitchhiking along desert roads. Each rumor ignited a burst of hope for the families, only to collapse into disappointment when police determined the tips were false. The constant cycle of speculation and letdown weighed heavily, and in moments of frustration some relatives accused the media of exploiting their suffering for headlines. Yet the attention also had value. Donations poured in to support the search efforts, allowing for extended helicopter flights and volunteer coordination. Missing posters reached further than the families could have managed alone, spreading the faces of their children into cities hundreds of miles away. Strangers sent letters of sympathy, prayers, and offers of assistance, reminders that even in a sea of rumor and noise, compassion still existed. But as the weeks stretched into months and the cameras moved on to newer stories, the families were left behind with the lingering echo of that media storm. The nation's fascination faded, but the silence of the desert remained, holding on to the truth that no speculation or headline could uncover. The Nevada desert where the friends vanished was a place that could erase lives in silence. Stretching for hundreds of miles, it was a landscape both hauntingly beautiful and mercilessly harsh. By day, the sun burned with a relentless intensity, baking the ground until the air shimmered and the horizon blurred. By night the temperature plummeted, the heat draining away to leave the sand and stone cold enough to freeze fingers in hours. For those unprepared, it was a land that offered no mercy, a place where a simple mechanical failure could turn quickly into a fight for survival. Search teams who scoured the area in 2006 spoke of how quickly the terrain swallowed evidence. Tire tracks faded within hours beneath shifting winds, footprints vanished as sand slid back into place, and personal belongings could be buried within a single storm. The desert was alive with movement, not in the way of bustling cities but in the restless shifting of Earth itself. Even modern technology struggled here, with GPS signals dropping and radios crackling into static. It was a vastness that could reduce even the most determined effort into futility. Investigators described the silence as unnerving. Out in the open, surrounded by nothing but rolling dunes and jagged mesas, they would pause and realize they could not hear anything but their own breathing. The stillness made it difficult to imagine four young friends simply vanishing, yet it was that very stillness that offered the only answer. The desert had a way of taking and keeping. Families who traveled there to join the search felt its weight as they stood under the unbroken sky. They realized how small a Jeep could seem against such a backdrop, how quickly a group of people could disappear without a trace. As weeks turned into months, and the trail grew colder, the desert became a symbol of both mystery and despair. It was no longer just a landscape, it was the keeper of secrets, the silent witness to what had happened. Parents and siblings would return to its edges in the years that followed, staring out across the emptiness, hoping the wind might shift and reveal some clue. But the desert kept its silence, holding the fate of the four friends within its vast, unyielding expanse. Weeks into the search, a fragile breakthrough seemed to offer hope. Investigators obtained security footage from a small gas station along a highway that cut through the desert, dated the day after the friends had last called home. The grainy video showed the green Jeep pulling into the lot just before dusk. Headlights reflected off dusty chrome as the vehicle rolled up to the pump. Inside the convenience store, the clerk remembered four young people coming in for snacks and drinks, laughing and teasing each other in the casual way only friends could. One purchased a pack of bottled water, another joked about the heat, and together they left with bags in hand before driving off toward the empty stretch of highway that led deeper into the desert. For the families, seeing the footage was both a comfort and a torment. It was proof that their children had made it that far, proof that they were alive and together after leaving their last known stop. Yet it was also the last confirmed trace, the final captured image of the four friends before they disappeared. Parents replayed the tape over and over, memorizing every detail, searching for anything unusual in the background or in their children's faces. All they saw was joy, the innocence of youth, unaware of what lay ahead. The clerk who had served them described them as upbeat and polite, asking about directions to the next town. He recalled nothing alarming, no one following them, no strange interactions in the parking lot. It was as if they had vanished into thin air the moment they pulled away. Investigators traced their route forward, checking with highway patrol, nearby diners, and other fuel stops, but the Jeep was never seen again. That short clip of security footage became a haunting artifact. News stations played it repeatedly, framing it as the last known sighting, while families clung to the soundless images like a lifeline. Watching their children move through the store felt like a window into the past, a cruel reminder of how quickly ordinary moments could become the last memories preserved. It left them with the agonizing question that would linger for years: what happened on the road after the laughter faded and the camera stopped recording? In the year that followed, investigators found themselves chasing shadows. Dozens of tips came in from across Nevada and beyond, each carrying the fragile hope of resolution, and each one collapsing under scrutiny. A trucker swore he had seen a Jeep matching the description parked outside a rest stop at dawn, but security checks turned up nothing. A tourist claimed she spotted 4 young people who looked like the missing friends in a diner off the interstate, but receipts and surveillance cameras showed only strangers passing through. Even psychics called in with visions of abandoned cabins and desert caves, distracting families desperate for answers and draining resources from the official search. The most painful leads were those that seemed plausible at first. A weathered Jeep was found abandoned near a dry creek bed, its paint dulled by the sun, but the license plate proved it belonged to a local rancher. A backpack discovered in a wash contained nothing more than camping gear lost months earlier. Each discovery sent waves of anticipation through the families, only to end in crushing disappointment. The cycle repeated so often that detectives began to guard their words carefully, cautious not to fuel false hope when presenting new findings. Rumors spread easily in the vacuum of truth. Some suggested the friends had crossed paths with dangerous strangers, while others insisted they had chosen to vanish, starting new lives under assumed identities. Neither theory fit the reality of who they were, yet the families were forced to hear their children's names twisted into speculation by strangers who knew nothing of their lives. The burden of these rumors fell hardest at night, when silence made room for doubt and grief. By the end of the year, the investigation was little more than scattered files and unanswered calls. Detectives admitted privately that the desert might never give up its secrets. For the families, hope began to thin under the weight of time, though none of them could bring themselves to stop searching. They clung to the belief that some overlooked clue was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The tragedy was not just the disappearance itself, but the endless limbo of chasing leads that dissolved into nothing, leaving only questions behind. By 2008, the search had slowed to a reluctant crawl. The initial rush of helicopters, K-9 units, and volunteer convoys had long since dispersed, leaving behind empty deserts and families still waiting by their phones. Officially, the case shifted into the category of a cold file, the kind that sat in steel cabinets with photographs clipped to the front and unanswered questions stacked inside. Detectives assigned to new cases admitted quietly that there were no leads left to follow, no evidence left to test. The 4 friends had simply vanished, and without fresh information, the trail was as barren as the sand that had swallowed it. For the families, this quieting of the investigation was unbearable. They had grown accustomed to constant activity, to daily updates, even when those updates carried no progress. Now there was only silence. Parents attended county meetings pleading with sheriffs to keep the search alive. Siblings wrote letters to state officials, begging for resources to be reallocated. Some turned to private investigators, scraping together savings to fund searches that yielded no more than the official ones had. Every road trip, every desert hike ended the same way, with tired footsteps and no sign of the Jeep. The community, once united in volunteer efforts, began to drift as well. Sympathy remained, but the urgency faded, replaced by other news stories and other tragedies. The faces of the 4 students, once posted on every utility pole in nearby towns, began to peel and fade under the desert sun until only ghostly outlines remained. Time was working against the families, wearing away the sharpness of memory and eroding the case into rumor. And yet, the pain did not lessen. Every holiday was marked by an empty chair, every milestone by the knowledge that their loved ones were not there to share it. Parents described the feeling as being trapped between two worlds, unable to grieve fully without answers but unable to hope without evidence. The desert, they believed, held the truth, but it would not speak. By the end of that year, the disappearance of the four friends had become another unsolved mystery, filed away but never forgotten. The Jeep, their belongings, and their fate remained hidden, waiting beneath layers of silence for the day when the desert might decide to give them back. The years passed with agonizing slowness, and yet with startling speed. What had once been urgent searches across blistering sand gave way to annual vigils where families gathered in church halls and small community centers, holding candles against the dark and repeating the same unanswered prayers. 10 years was a lifetime for some, and a blink for others. For parents it felt like an endless pause, a decade of waiting for a knock on the door that might finally bring answers. Each anniversary brought reporters back with cameras, asking the same questions, and each time the families gave the same tearful replies. They wanted their children found. They wanted closure, even if closure came wrapped in grief. The desert, however, remained unmoved. Sandstorms swept across the open plains, shifting dunes and swallowing tracks as if erasing history itself. Travelers who drove those highways saw nothing but emptiness. The Jeep, if it still existed, was hidden somewhere in that unforgiving sprawl, buried beneath the weight of years and silence. For siblings, the absence settled into daily life in quieter ways. Birthdays passed with one less cake, graduations with one less cheer from the crowd. They kept photos in frames on their dressers, faces of young adults frozen at the age they had vanished. They wondered often what they would look like now, who they might have become, and if the desert had taken not just their lives, but all the futures that should have followed. The case files gathered dust, and the detectives once assigned moved on to other jobs, some retiring, others relocating. The families were left to carry the weight, united only by shared grief and the stubborn refusal to let the world forget. At times, hope felt impossible, but still they clung to it, because letting go felt like betrayal. 10 years after the Jeep disappeared into the Nevada wilderness, the mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved. The desert had become both graveyard and vault, keeping its secrets with ruthless indifference. Then, in the summer of 2016, a storm would sweep across that barren land and shift the sands just enough to uncover a sliver of metal. It was the first sign in a decade that the silence was finally beginning to crack. It was the kind of discovery no one expected. In the summer of 2016, after a violent sandstorm swept through a stretch of desert near a dry lakebed, a hiker stumbled across something strange protruding from the earth. At first it looked like nothing more than a rusted piece of metal, the kind of debris often carried on the wind and left behind by decades of travelers. But as he drew closer, he saw the distinct curve of a roof, paint dulled by sun and sand but unmistakably belonging to a vehicle. The desert had shifted just enough to uncover a secret it had guarded for 10 long years. The man called local authorities, his voice tight with urgency as he explained what he had found. By the time deputies arrived, half the vehicle was visible, the sandstorm having swept away layers of dust that had once concealed it completely. There was no mistaking the boxy outline of an older Jeep Cherokee, its windows cracked, its paint faded to a pale green-gray. A quick check of the license plate confirmed what no one wanted to believe but everyone already knew. The Jeep belonged to the 4 missing college friends who had vanished a decade earlier. News of the discovery spread quickly, drawing law enforcement, forensic teams, and eventually the families who had waited so long for answers. Investigators erected tents around the site, shielding it from the relentless sun as they began the slow process of excavation. The Jeep had been nearly swallowed by the desert, only its roofline betraying its presence, and it took hours of careful digging to expose it fully. Cameras recorded every step, documenting the moment when a mystery that had haunted 2 states for 10 years shifted from speculation to grim reality. For the families, standing near the cordoned-off site was almost unbearable. The sight of the Jeep felt like stepping back into 2006, as if time had folded in on itself and brought the past crashing into the present. It was no longer just a story on missing person flyers or fading photographs. It was real, tangible, and buried here in the sand all along. Whatever answers lay inside would be painful, but they were answers at last, and that was something the desert could no longer keep hidden. The excavation of the Jeep became a delicate operation, carried out under the watchful eyes of both investigators and grieving families who stood at a distance behind police tape. Heavy machinery was avoided to prevent damaging the vehicle, so deputies and forensic technicians worked with shovels and brushes, slowly peeling back the sand that had encased it for a decade. Each layer revealed more of the Jeep's weathered frame, the wheels sunken deep into the earth, the once bright paint now dulled to a lifeless green. The windshield was cracked, its surface sandblasted by years of storms until it appeared frosted and opaque. As the vehicle emerged, the harsh truth of its isolation became clear. There were no roads nearby, no signs of tire tracks or trails. It seemed as though the desert itself had swallowed the Jeep whole and hidden it away. Investigators noted how the terrain sloped into a shallow basin, a natural trap where drifting sand could pile up and entomb anything caught there. It explained why aerial searches years earlier had found nothing, the Jeep buried beyond visibility within weeks of its abandonment. When the last of the sand was cleared, officers opened the doors carefully, half expecting to find remains inside. Instead, the interior was eerily preserved. Dust coated the seats, but there were no bodies, only belongings that spoke of the four friends who had once occupied the space. A backpack slumped in the back seat, a pair of sunglasses still perched on the dashboard, a crumpled fast food wrapper wedged in the console. The glove compartment contained a folded map, its edges frayed from use, while the rear held water bottles, one still half full, its liquid, long undrinkable, but intact. Technicians documented every detail before moving the Jeep onto a flatbed truck for transport to a secure facility. Families watched in silence, torn between relief that something tangible had finally been found and heartbreak that it confirmed what they had long feared. For a decade, they had imagined countless scenarios, clung to rumors and whispers of hope. Now the reality stood before them, in rust and sand, a time capsule of their children's last journey. The Jeep had been found, but the friends were still missing, their fate hidden somewhere beyond those desolate hills. The desert had given back only part of the story, and the rest would have to be uncovered piece by painful piece. When investigators finally opened the Jeep, the atmosphere was heavy with expectation. Everyone present knew that what lay inside could either answer years of questions or deepen the mystery. The doors creaked as they were pried open, the stale air of a decade trapped in darkness escaping into the desert wind. Flashlights cut across the interior, illuminating the relics of a journey interrupted. On the passenger seat rested a faded backpack, its zipper half open, revealing notebooks, a few pens, and a packet of gum hardened into a solid block. In the back seat, a pair of sneakers sat neatly side by side, as though their owner had slipped them off before resting. A set of sunglasses still clung to the dashboard, warped by heat but recognizable in style. The floor was littered with crumbs and wrappers, small reminders of the road trip's last meals. One item drew immediate attention. Wedged between the seats was a cell phone, its screen cracked and casing warped, but intact enough to be logged as evidence. Forensic teams handled it with care, hopeful that even after years of exposure, something might be recovered from its memory. Alongside it was a half-empty bottle of water, the liquid clouded but still sloshing inside, a haunting reminder of the desperation that must have come when supplies began to run out. The glove compartment contained a folded paper map, worn at the edges, marked with circles and underlines in pen. It suggested the group had been navigating carefully, perhaps noting gas stops or alternate routes. In the rear cargo space, investigators found another backpack with clothing, sunscreen, and a camera whose battery had long since corroded. Each discovery was catalogued, photographed, and sealed, building a picture of 4 young lives suddenly interrupted in the middle of ordinary motion. What was most striking, however, was what they did not find. There were no human remains, no sign of struggle, no evidence of violence inside the vehicle. It was as though the friends had simply stepped out and walked away, leaving behind the artifacts of their lives. For the families who stood nearby, watching each item carried out in evidence bags, it was a strange comfort and a fresh agony. The Jeep had given them pieces of the story, but not the ending. The desert still held that truth somewhere beyond the reach of headlights and maps. The discovery of the Jeep breathed new life into a case long considered unsolvable. Files that had sat untouched for years were reopened, and detectives who had once moved on to other assignments were called back to provide insight. Younger investigators, trained with tools that did not exist a decade earlier, took the lead, approaching the evidence with fresh eyes and advanced technology. DNA swabs were taken from every surface of the vehicle, hoping to capture a trace of the friends who had vanished or perhaps someone else who might have crossed their path. The broken phone was rushed to a lab specializing in digital forensics, where technicians began the delicate process of extracting whatever fragments of data still survived. The map found in the glove compartment became a central focus. Forensic analysts carefully flattened its creases and studied the ink markings. Certain circles and underlines suggested possible destinations, while faint smudges hinted at stops they may have considered. Investigators traced the marked routes against old weather records and search patterns, comparing them with the terrain where the Jeep had been buried. It was as if the group had left behind a breadcrumb trail, one that had been waiting 10 years to be read correctly. Witness interviews were revived, too. The gas station clerk who had last seen the friends was contacted again, asked to recall details that memory had tried to fade. Retired officers were brought in to recount decisions made in the early days of the search, choices that might now be reevaluated in light of new findings. Families were called back into the process, sitting once more in police stations under harsh fluorescent lights, answering questions that had tormented them for a decade. National media returned to the story, cameras once again pointed at the desert where the Jeep had been unearthed. For the families, it was a bittersweet sight, the sudden surge of attention reopening wounds, while also reminding them that their children had not been forgotten. Detectives assured them this time was different. They had a vehicle, belongings, and technology that could dig deeper than before. The case was no longer a closed file gathering dust. It was active, urgent, and alive again. The desert had finally given up a piece of its secret, and now investigators were determined to uncover the rest. When word reached the families that the Jeep had been found, they traveled to Nevada with a mixture of dread and relief heavy in their hearts. For 10 years they had lived in a suspended state, imagining countless endings but never having proof. Now, standing on the edge of the excavation site, they were confronted with the tangible reality of what had been hidden all along. The vehicle was more than a piece of evidence. It was a relic of their children's last days, the last place they had sat together, laughed together, and planned a future that never came. Some parents wept openly at the sight, unable to contain the tidal wave of grief that broke over them. Others stood rigid, hands clenched, their faces locked in expressions of disbelief. One mother whispered her son's name as though calling him back into the world, while a father reached out to touch the police tape, needing some physical connection to the space that had become sacred by association. Siblings gathered close, clutching photographs they had carried for years, their eyes darting between the Jeep and the desert horizon as though hoping to see their loved ones still walking toward them. Authorities did their best to shield the families from the harsh details, but nothing could disguise the emotional impact. The belongings removed from the Jeep were laid out carefully on tables for identification. Familiar objects sparked sharp reactions. A pair of shoes recognized instantly, a notebook filled with handwriting that had not been seen in a decade, A sun-bleached baseball cap that once shaded a young man's smile. Each item was confirmation and heartbreak in equal measure. The desert air felt heavy, the silence broken only by the clicking of cameras and the low murmur of investigators conferring. For the families, this moment was both a gift and a wound. The Jeep's recovery did not bring their children home, but it proved they had been here, that their journey had ended in this vast, unforgiving landscape. It stripped away the fantasies that they might still be alive somewhere, yet it offered the first real steps toward answers. They left the site with hearts aching, knowing closure was still far off, but with the faint comfort that the mystery was finally beginning to unravel. The forensic examination of the Jeep brought the first concrete theories about what had gone wrong. Technicians who studied the engine found that it had seized, most likely from overheating after prolonged strain in desert conditions. The radiator showed signs of failure, and the oil had long since solidified into a crust that told of mechanical breakdown. The tires were in no better state. Shredded rubber clung to bent rims, evidence that the vehicle had been driven far beyond what it could endure. Investigators concluded the friends had likely pushed the Jeep until it failed completely, leaving them stranded miles from the nearest town or highway. Inside the cabin, dust had settled over everything like a second skin, but some objects still spoke of those final days. Food wrappers and empty bottles suggested they had rationed what little they had. The broken cell phone, though too damaged to function, hinted at desperate attempts to call for help in a place where signal was rare. No violent struggle was apparent. No signs of intrusion suggested the involvement of others. Instead, the evidence painted a picture of a group brought down not by malice but by the merciless reality of the desert. Forensic teams reconstructed the timeline as best they could. The Jeep likely failed late in the afternoon when the sun's heat lingered into the evening. Perhaps they stayed with it for a day, hoping a passing car might appear on the distant road. But the location of the Jeep, hidden in a low basin far from the main highway, made rescue unlikely. When the water bottles ran low and hope of discovery dwindled, the friends would have been forced to make a choice: stay with the safety of the vehicle or risk walking out into an endless horizon that offered no guarantee of salvation. For the families, hearing these findings was a painful revelation. It was easier to imagine their children taken by some sinister force than to picture them slowly realizing they were trapped, the desert closing around them. The Jeep had confirmed their struggle, preserved the outline of their final hours, yet the absence of bodies meant the story was still unfinished. Somewhere beyond those shifting dunes lay the rest of the truth, waiting to be uncovered. The discovery of the Jeep led search teams back into the desert with renewed determination. This time they came armed with ground-penetrating radar, drones, and tracking equipment far more advanced than what had been available a decade earlier. Investigators fanned out from the basin where the vehicle had been buried, studying the landscape for anything out of place. To the naked eye, the desert looked unchanged, its surface a patchwork of sand, scrub, and stone, but technology revealed faint disturbances just beneath the crust. One set of readings drew particular attention. Subtle patterns stretched outward from the Jeep, faint impressions preserved beneath layers of shifting grit. They were not fresh, but their alignment suggested the movement of several individuals, footprints fossilized by time and weather. The patterns led away from the vehicle in two directions, diverging toward the distant hills. Forensic specialists marked each trace, mapping them carefully, and though the prints were incomplete and fragmented, they told a haunting story. It appeared the four friends had stayed together for a time before splitting into two pairs, perhaps in desperation, perhaps in disagreement about which path offered the best chance of finding help. The distances involved were daunting. The hills lay many miles away, shimmering in the distance, far beyond the reach of anyone carrying little water and no shelter. Investigators followed the trails cautiously, using drones to scan ahead while searchers on foot combed the ground for physical evidence. In places, the footprints vanished completely, swallowed by erosion or covered by drifts of sand, only to reappear faintly further on. A fragment of cloth was found snagged on desert brush, sun-bleached and brittle, possibly torn from a shirt. A shoe print pressed into hardened soil still held a clear tread pattern that matched one of the sneakers found in the Jeep. Each discovery confirmed the heartbreaking reality that the friends had tried to save themselves the only way they could, by walking into the wilderness. For the families, the knowledge was agonizing but strangely grounding. After years of imagining abduction or foul play, the evidence suggested a simpler, more tragic truth. Their children had fought to survive against the desert itself, leaving behind a trail that had waited 10 years to be seen. The search into the hills stretched across days, teams working carefully in the punishing heat, pausing often to sip water and shield themselves from the relentless sun. Each step felt like retracing the last movements of the four friends, an act both scientific and deeply human. The desert seemed unchanged from a decade earlier, its silence heavy, its ridges and gullies offering no mercy to those who crossed them. Yet, in the stillness, investigators began to find fragments that broke the monotony of sand and stone. Near a dry wash, a piece of fabric clung to the base of a mesquite bush. It was little more than a shred, its color long since drained by sun and wind, but its stitching matched the style of clothing worn in the mid-2000s. A short distance away, a fragment of plastic gleamed against the ground, revealed when a gust of wind cleared loose sand. It was part of a water bottle, brittle and cracked but unmistakably aged, its label only faintly legible. These were not random litter carried by storms. They belonged to someone who had passed this way and never returned. The most sobering discovery came when a team navigating a ridge spotted what appeared to be bone fragments scattered near a rocky outcrop. At first they were unsure, but closer inspection confirmed the worst. Sun-bleached and worn by time, the remains were fragile, nearly blending into the pale landscape around them. Investigators halted the search immediately, marking the site and calling in forensic anthropologists to handle the recovery with the care it demanded. News of the discovery reached the families within hours. They gathered once again in Nevada, hearts clenched against the mixture of grief and relief. After 10 years of imagining every possibility, confirmation was both unbearable and necessary. The desert had finally begun to give them back pieces of the children it had taken. For the search teams, the discovery changed the tone of the mission. This was no longer just about finding belongings or footprints. It was about honoring lives cut short, piecing together their final struggle with dignity. As the remains were carefully collected, the desert's silence felt heavier than ever, as though it still resisted giving up the full story of what had happened in those final days. The remains recovered from the rocky outcrop were transported to a forensic lab in Reno, where anthropologists and pathologists worked with quiet precision. Each fragment was cataloged, examined, and compared against the DNA samples the families had long ago provided. For days the results were uncertain, the possibility lingering that the bones might not belong to the missing friends at all, but to other travelers lost in the desert's long history of silence. When the results came back, the truth was both devastating and grounding. 2 of the missing students had been identified, their DNA matching beyond doubt. After a decade of unanswered questions, part of the mystery had finally taken on a name. When the families received the news, grief crashed over them with a weight they had carried for years but never fully faced. There were tears, embraces, and a silence that spoke louder than words. Knowing that 2 of the 4 had perished in the desert was no surprise, yet hearing it confirmed stripped away the fragile hope that had lingered. Still, for some parents, there was comfort in knowing, in having something tangible to mourn rather than living forever in the shadow of uncertainty. The identification ignited a new wave of national attention. Reporters crowded the lab's entrance, eager to tell the story of the case once again. Cameras panned across the desert and over the Jeep as though they too could capture the desperation of those final days. But beyond the headlines, investigators focused on the evidence itself. The remains showed no sign of violence, no fractures suggesting foul play. Instead, the indications pointed to exposure, dehydration, and exhaustion. The desert had been the enemy all along. For the families of the two still unaccounted for, the news brought a sharper edge of torment. If half of the group had been found, then the others must still be out there, somewhere among the endless ridges and dunes. The search would continue, investigators promised, until every trace was brought home. But the desert was vast and merciless, and its grip was not easily broken. The Jeep had given them the first clue. The bones had given them the second. Now the hope remained that the desert would eventually surrender the rest of its secret, no matter how long it took. The confirmation of two identities did not quiet the questions. Instead, it sharpened the mystery of the others. Families and investigators alike were forced to confront the possibility that the group had splintered during their final hours. The footprints leading away from the Jeep had already suggested it, diverging into two separate paths toward the distant hills. Now, with only half the friends accounted for, it seemed almost certain that the others had gone another way, their fate hidden deeper in the desert. Search teams pressed forward, retracing the second trail marked by faint impressions in the soil. Drones scanned valleys and ridges, their cameras sweeping for anything unnatural against the monotony of sand and rock. On foot, investigators searched for personal belongings that might confirm the route. Scraps of fabric, broken shoes, discarded water bottles. Every discovery was carefully bagged and logged, each fragment a whisper of the journey that had once taken place. Yet no additional remains were found in those early weeks, only silence and the relentless sun. The families lived in limbo. For the parents who had received DNA confirmation, the grief of finality was tempered by the chance to bury their children with dignity, but it came alongside survivors' guilt. They looked across the room at the others, whose weight stretched on, and knew their relief was also another's torment. The remaining families still clung to the possibility that their loved ones had wandered farther and survived longer, perhaps leaving behind more clues that would explain why they had not been found with the others. Detectives struggled with the same questions. Why would two remain together while two chose another path? Had they argued about which direction held the best hope of rescue? Had illness or injury forced the group to split? Without answers, the desert remained a courtroom with no witness willing to testify. National coverage shifted its tone, no longer speaking of a single tragedy, but of two overlapping mysteries. The Jeep had returned from the sand, and two lives had been identified, but the story was incomplete. The fate of the remaining friends lingered like a shadow, stretching across the desert floor, a reminder that closure had only come halfway and the hardest truths still lay hidden beyond reach. Among the belongings recovered from the Jeep was a small spiral-bound notebook, its cover warped and pages stuck together from years of exposure to heat and dust. At first it seemed too damaged to be of use, but forensic technicians painstakingly separated and dried each sheet, using gentle heat and chemical treatments to preserve the fragile paper. Slowly, faint ink lines emerged, revealing hurried handwriting that carried the weight of desperation. It was a journal, written during the friends' final days, and within its pages lay the closest thing to their voices since the day they vanished. The entries began in steady script, describing the Jeep's breakdown and their efforts to repair it. One note mentioned the engine overheating, another the shredded tires. They wrote about conserving supplies, rationing water, and waiting for passing cars that never came. There was frustration but also reassurance, the kind of words young friends tell one another when the situation is serious but not yet dire. Yet as the entries continued, the writing grew shakier, the words less certain. Several pages spoke of the heat and how it pressed down on them relentlessly, draining their energy until even short walks felt unbearable. They scribbled about arguments over what to do, whether to stay with the Jeep or strike out toward the shimmering hills on the horizon. A sketch of the map they had carried was drawn in faint lines, circles marking potential water sources that might or might not exist. The notebook captured both their determination and their fear, a record of the moment hope began to fray. What struck investigators most was the humanity within the pages. Jokes scrawled in the margins, reassurances written to one another, promises that they would all make it out alive. It was not just a document of survival, it was a portrait of friendship under the crushing weight of circumstance. For the families, reading the words was both a gift and a torment. They could hear their children's voices again, sense their personalities in the phrasing, and imagine the moments when those words were written. But the unfinished pages, ending abruptly with no clear resolution, left them aching for the rest of the story. The journal was proof that their children had fought, that they had hoped, and that they had not given up easily, even as the desert closed around them. The notebook's later entries painted a picture of 4 young people caught in a slow spiral of desperation. The words described the endless sun, the way it drained their bodies until even standing felt like lifting stone. One entry noted that they had begun limiting themselves to sips of water every few hours, each bottle carefully counted, every drop measured like gold. Their food was little more than scraps, granola bars divided into pieces too small to satisfy hunger, but just enough to keep them moving. As the days passed, the writing revealed the creeping onset of dehydration. There were mentions of dizziness, lips cracked and bleeding, skin burning under the sun no matter how they tried to shield themselves with shirts and hats. One of them recorded that the Jeep's shadow had been their only relief, a shrinking patch of shade they huddled under until it was gone. The journal spoke of arguments too, flashes of anger between friends whose patience thinned as quickly as their strength. Yet, after each disagreement came apologies, scribbled promises not to give up on one another. The entries became harder to read toward the end, the handwriting jagged and uneven. One passage described the sight of distant lights, perhaps a mirage, perhaps a town, but they could not be certain. Another note admitted fear that they might not all survive, though it was quickly followed by reassurances that they had to keep faith. The tone shifted from confident planning to raw survival, the words of young people confronting a reality far harsher than anything they had imagined when they set out. For investigators, the journal offered heartbreaking clarity. It showed there had been no outside interference, no abduction or foul play. The desert itself had been their undoing. For the families, it was almost unbearable to read. They could picture their children in those final hours, clinging to one another while their strength ebbed away. The handwriting, still recognizable after 10 years, carried the weight of voices silenced too soon. The journal did not end with resolution. The final entry trailed off mid-sentence, the ink faded where the pen had pressed too lightly against the page. It was as if the desert itself had stolen the ending, leaving behind only fragments of their last struggle beneath the unrelenting sun. The journal offered a painful clue to the group's final decision. One entry, written in uneven lines, described how they had debated leaving the Jeep behind. Some argued that staying with the vehicle increased their chances of being spotted by aircraft or passing drivers. Others insisted that waiting meant death, that they had to move toward the distant ridges where water or shelter might exist. The disagreement grew sharp enough that it split the group in two. 2 would remain with the Jeep, conserving supplies and hoping for rescue, while the other 2 set out on foot with the map and what little water they could carry. Investigators believed this decision explained why only 2 sets of remains had been found near the rocky outcrop. Those who stayed with the Jeep must have eventually tried to follow or collapsed before making it far. The pair who left first had taken the risk of distance, walking toward the shimmering horizon that promised safety but delivered only more sand and heat. It was a choice made under pressure, with no right answer, each option carrying its own kind of peril. For the families, imagining that moment was unbearable. They pictured their children arguing under the relentless sun, voices raised not out of anger but out of fear. They could almost hear the pleas, the desperate promises that splitting up would double their chances. It was the kind of decision no young person should have had to make, but in that silence, with water running out and the desert closing in, it must have seemed the only way forward. Search teams followed the second set of faint tracks, though after 10 years the desert had erased most of them. Here and there a shoeprint or scrap of fabric hinted at their path, but no remains had yet been recovered. Still, the evidence suggested they had walked for miles, driven by the hope that something waited beyond the ridges. The tragedy was that hope itself had been their undoing. The Jeep, preserved beneath sand, told of the place where their journey faltered. The journal revealed the moment they chose two different paths. The desert had claimed them either way, leaving only fragments behind for investigators to piece together, and grief for the families who finally understood how impossible the choices had been. As investigators pushed further along the second trail, the desert began to yield small, haunting tokens of the journey. A shoe, half buried in sand, was the first, its sole cracked and upper bleached, nearly white from years of exposure. The size and style matched one of the missing friends, a heartbreaking confirmation that the tracks they had followed truly belonged to the group. A few miles further on, searchers uncovered a strip of cloth snagged against jagged stone, its faded color suggesting it had once been bright, perhaps part of a shirt worn when the trip began with laughter and anticipation. Each find narrowed the distance between speculation and truth. Search teams worked slowly, careful not to overlook even the smallest trace. They combed through gullies and dry washes where flash floods might have carried objects from their original resting place. The desert revealed them reluctantly, as though surrendering its secrets only after years of silence. Among the artifacts was the rusted frame of a pair of eyeglasses, the lenses long gone, the metal warped but still recognizable to family members who had provided photos of their children wearing them. The most sobering discovery came when a drone survey identified an unusual scatter of bone fragments near a ridgeline. Teams on the ground moved in and confirmed that they were human remains, sun-bleached and fragile, scattered by time and weather, but unmistakably belonging to one of the missing. DNA would later confirm the identity, bringing closure to another family while deepening the agony for the last who still waited. Forensic experts explained that the remains told a story of collapse and exposure. The body had likely succumbed to exhaustion and dehydration after miles of walking, falling where the desert finally took its toll. The evidence suggested that the other friend who had set out on the same path may have pressed forward alone, leaving investigators to wonder how far they might have gone before meeting the same fate. For the families, the discoveries were both merciless and merciful. Each item was a reminder of suffering, yet also a piece of their children returned after years of absence. The desert was still holding back the final chapter, but with every fragment, every bone, the silence grew thinner, and the truth crept closer to the surface. The final breakthrough came months after the Jeep's discovery, when another team returned to the desert determined to finish the search. They expanded the perimeter beyond the last confirmed site of remains, focusing on a series of dry arroyos that cut across the plain like scars. It was there, in a shallow depression partly hidden by brush, that they found the last traces of the missing. A scattering of bones lay half buried in sand, fragile and pale, accompanied by scraps of fabric that once formed a shirt and the corroded buckle of a belt. Nearby, a cracked plastic canteen rested empty, its cap missing, as if discarded in exhaustion during the final hours. The remains were gathered with the same care and reverence as the others, carried out under a silence that weighed heavily on everyone present. Forensic experts confirmed what the evidence had long suggested. The last two friends had succumbed to the desert just as the first had, their strength eroded by heat, thirst, and distance. There were no marks of violence, no signs of another presence. The desert itself had been the relentless adversary. For the families, the recovery of all four brought a mix of emotions too complex to name. Grief surged anew as funerals were finally planned, 10 years later than they should have been. Yet alongside the sorrow was a fragile sense of peace, the knowledge that their children's story, though unbearably tragic, was no longer an open wound of uncertainty. They could be mourned properly, remembered as more than faces on missing posters. Investigators closed the case with their findings documented in careful detail. The Jeep, the journal, the scattered belongings, and the remains all told the same story. A mechanical breakdown in one of the harshest landscapes in America had set into motion a chain of decisions that ended in tragedy. The desert had hidden them for a decade, but it had not erased their struggle. As the families stood together at the edge of the sand where the last recovery was made, they felt the enormity of what had been returned. The desert had taken their children, but it had also preserved pieces of their fight for life. In that knowledge, painful as it was, lay the closing of a circle that had remained open far too long. The funerals came quietly, scattered across different towns but united in grief. 10 years after the four friends had set out on their carefree road trip, their families gathered to finally lay them to rest. Photographs lined the aisles of churches and community halls, images of smiling young faces frozen in time. Friends from college, older now and carrying lives of their own, returned to stand with the families, remembering the laughter, the music, and the easy companionship that had once filled dorm rooms and late-night study sessions. The coffins were smaller than they should have been, some carrying only fragments of what the desert had returned, but they carried the full weight of lives lost too soon. For parents, the finality was both unbearable and necessary. No longer would they wake each morning wondering if their children might still be alive somewhere, waiting to be found. That fragile hope had been both a comfort and a torment for a decade. Now, at last, they could grieve without the cruel question of what if. For siblings, the loss left permanent gaps in family photos and milestones that would never be shared. Yet they spoke of carrying their brothers' and sisters' memories forward, ensuring their stories would not vanish into silence. Investigators closed the case with solemn words. There was no crime to punish, no villain to name, only the desert itself, vast and indifferent. The Jeep had become a symbol of how easily even the strongest bonds and brightest futures could be undone by nature's unforgiving hand. Forensic evidence, journal pages, and the scattered belongings told the story of courage and desperation, of young lives refusing to give up until the desert allowed no more. In the years that followed, travelers passing through Nevada would sometimes stop near the dry lake bed where the Jeep was found. Some left flowers, others left notes weighted with stones to keep them from blowing away. It became a quiet memorial, a reminder to strangers of the fragility of life and the power of the land to both conceal and reveal. For the families, closure was not the end of grief, but the beginning of memory. They had their answers, painful as they were, and they had each other. And in that unity, they found a fragile strength to move forward, carrying the story of four friends whose final journey was swallowed by the desert but never forgotten.